All right, let's dive into a really complex story coming out of Nepal. It's all about technology, language, and, you guessed it, power. So this is the question that really sits at the heart of this whole thing. And you might be thinking, how on earth does a social media ban lead to something so tragic? Well, it turns out this was the boiling point for a long simmering tension between a government and its, super digitally savvy citizens. 19. That's the number. In September 2025, that was the human cost of a nationwide social media blackout. I mean, it's a staggering number, right? It really forces you to ask, how did things get so bad? What pushed this situation to such a tragic breaking point? So let's get into it and figure out exactly what went down. Okay, so we're starting right in the middle of the action here. We're talking about these explosive youth-led protests that just completely rocked Nepal, an event that's now being called the Gen Z uprising. And when I say it happened fast, I mean incredibly fast. 1 minute, everything's normal. The next, the government just pulls the plug on pretty much every major social platform. We're talking Facebook, YouTube, X, the whole shebang. And what happens? Almost immediately, the country's youth are out on the streets. These protests, they escalate into violent clashes. People even stormed the parliament. And get this, in just 5 days, the government does a complete 180 and lifts the ban. You see, this wasn't just some protest against censorship. No. This was a full-on societal rupture. And to really get why, you have to understand that for this generation, these platforms were everything. I mean, their social lives, their political organizing, even how they made money. So cutting that off, well, it was literally like cutting a lifeline. So to really wrap our heads around the impact of that ban, we've got to understand just how massive social media's role was in Nepal. Think about it this way. It's not just another app on your phone. It is the public square. It's the entire arena. Okay, the numbers here are, well, they're just astounding. By 2025, you've got nearly half of Nepal's entire population, that's 14 million people, on social media. And just look at this chart. Facebook isn't just a big player, it's practically a monopoly, grabbing a staggering 87% of all social media traffic. It's not one of many options, it is the option. It is the platform. And this quote, it just nails the core idea, doesn't it? When one single platform has that much control over the national conversation, its algorithms aren't just, recommending funny cat videos. They're essentially deciding what becomes politically important. The code itself is shaping what an entire country sees, what gets debated, and maybe even more importantly, what gets completely ignored. Yeah. These invisible editors, what we're really talking about are algorithms. You can think of them like a secret recipe that decides what pops up first in your feed, what goes viral, and what just disappears. But here's the thing. These recipes, they had a major flaw, a huge blind spot, and it was causing all sorts of problems long before the government ever stepped in. And this brings us to the next really crucial piece of this puzzle. See, the problem wasn't just about what the algorithms were pushing to the top. It was about what they couldn't even understand in the first place. So think about it like this. Most of these big social media algorithms are trained on what are called high-resource languages, like English. They have mountains and mountains of data to learn from. But Nepali, well, it's a low-resource language. That means there just isn't enough data out there for the AI to get really good at it. It can't pick up on the nuance, the slang, or all the cultural context. And what you end up with is this kind of two-sided failure. It's a total mess. On the one hand, you've got genuinely awful stuff, hate speech, dangerous misinformation, slipping right through the cracks because the algorithm just doesn't get it. But then, on the other hand, perfectly harmless stuff, like political satire or just cultural commentary, gets mistakenly flagged and taken down. So it fails in both directions. It's the worst of both worlds. And get this. Studies show that these automated systems mislabel somewhere between 11 and 20% of all Nepali social media content. That's a huge margin of error. So the big takeaway here is that the whole system was already incredibly fragile. It was creating this really volatile and unpredictable space for people to talk. Okay, so you have this really fragile digital ecosystem, right? Now let's see what happens when the government decides to step in and intervene directly. As you can imagine, it didn't go well. You can see a clear escalation on this timeline. It really started small back in 2023 with a ban on just one platform, TikTok. You could almost see that as a test run. But by 2025, they went from that sort of surgical strike to just a complete blackout. It was a total collision course, right? You had the state trying to clamp down and assert control, and you had a population that was just completely dependent on these platforms for their daily lives. And that's really the key thing to understand here. When the government shut down these platforms, they weren't just silencing a few individual voices. They basically pulled the plug on the main arena, the digital town square, where an entire generation's culture and politics were being talked about, created, and shared. It was a massive shock to the system. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? I mean, it's easy to look at what happened in Nepal and think it's a unique situation, right? But it's actually a super powerful case study that has some really serious implications for the rest of the world. Okay, this whole story really highlights four super important points. First, this idea of algorithmic privilege. The code itself favors certain voices over others. Second, what's called polarization potential. Basically, algorithms that are designed to keep us hooked can also end up tearing us apart. Third is the backfire effect. You try to shut something down with a heavy hand and, whoops, you actually spark way more unrest. And finally, this whole thing redefines the digital divide. It's not just about who has internet access anymore. Now it's about whose language and culture the algorithms are even built to understand. And what the story from Nepal really shows us is that in fragile democracies, code doesn't just mediate culture, it can literally ignite it. And that really leaves us with a big, provocative question, doesn't it? One that applies way beyond Nepal. It challenges all of us to really think about who's holding the power, who's setting the rules, and who actually gets a say in our own digital public squares.